love, and these are all the Greek ones. So they really went all out on that concept, and so that's going to hopefully teach us a little bit about how different use cases and everything, and some of it's basic, and some of it is they're being used in different ways. But we'll get to that. So first of all, um, we're going to start with the examples because this will help us kind of give some of these definitions and stuff. So in John 3:16 is a pretty common one. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And the original Greek for that is agapo. I even need pronunciation guides, so I can still get it wrong, but at least I have an excuse. So agapo is to love, but in a social or a moral sense, to love something. Um, maybe friendly, you might say. And they compare that to filio, which we'll talk about later. But just in brief, filio is the difference between the two being agape is a social or moral sense, and the other one is being a friend. So someone that you actually care about because of a personal connection, and this is loving in a more general sense, agapo in this case. So God loved the entirety of the world. Now, I don't know why that's the Greek, why they picked that word. If it's because agapo is the one you use when you're talking about a large group of people, because you can't have a personal connection with the entire world. But that's what they're talking about there. The love expressed in John 3:16 is an agapo love. So something perhaps a little bit closer to home, Leviticus 19 verses 33 and 34. We've been talking about Leviticus a lot. It gets mentioned a little bit. I want to say we talked about this last week, but I've read so many things that maybe I read it somewhere else last week, and I'm the only one who knows this. But when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And the love here is Hebrew because it's Old Testament. And this is and it's to have affection for, sexually or otherwise. So beloved, love, loved, lovely, lover, to like, or a friend, these are all encompassed under this love. Have affection for the foreigner because you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt, which is interesting. That's not really something that we do anymore. But we also don't kiss people on the cheek when we meet them because we're not European or Middle Eastern. Just a cultural difference. So we're going to talk about some other examples. So the same usage there of love the foreigner. Genesis 27 verse 4. So this is Isaac is on his deathbed, and he asks his son Esau to bring him food. So he says, prepare me the kind of tasty food that I like, is how the NIV translates it. Bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die. And in the King James Version, they translated that as love. And this is, again, that same version of have affection for, be love, or to like. So not the kind of love that we are asked to have for each other is the same kind of love that Isaac had for this particular kind of food that he was asking his son to hunt down and prepare for him. That's probably not a relevant connection, but it's the same word. I'm not saying love people like you love ice cream, um, but there's at least some similarities there, hopefully. Genesis 29, 20, and 32. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. And then in verse 32, Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." So the love, when Leah is referring to her husband, saying, I hope he will love me now, is the same love that we see in Isaac loving food and how we're supposed to love our neighbors or treat the foreigners. Um, but in 20, when it's referring to Jacob's love for Rachel, it's just the feminine form of the same word. It conjugates differently because of the, as far as I can tell, I didn't actually go into the grammar on this like I was planning to, but essentially it's it appears from the usage that um, the person receiving it, or the person issuing the love, conjugate, I don't know, whatever. So same thing. It's technically a different word. It's, instead of ahab, it's ahab ah. They add an AH to the end of it, and that makes it the feminine form of the other word. It all means the same thing, though. So Deuteronomy 7:7 says, "The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor did he choose you, because you are more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people." And that's King James, but I said you instead of ye. So, but the NIV translates that same passage, Deuteronomy 7:7, for those of you that are turning there in your paper Bibles. Um, Lord did not set his affection upon you. And this is an example of a different type of love that we haven't looked at yet, which is, I still don't know, it gives me a pronunciation again, I still can't say this right. Chashak. It's spelled Chashaq, which means to cling or join, or figuratively to love or delight in. And there's some other reference, whatever, but essentially to love or to delight in, but also could mean to cling. And they choose to demonstrate this as affection. Then I choose to show you affection or to cling to you or join to you for any, for any merits of your own. It's not an earned love in this case, but it's that type of, but more caring and personal than kind of some of the other examples that we're going to look at. And Proverbs 15:17 says, "Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fattened calf with hatred." This is the same, that feminine form of al-haba that we talked about in Genesis 29, where Jacob loved Rachel. This is that same translation. Better to have that kind of love and eat healthfully than to eat unhealthfully and hate everybody. Ecclesiastes 3:1-8, which of course, or verse 1, because it kind of establishes the pattern, but there's everything and a season for go down through this list, and you get down to verse 8, and it says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. The love they're talking about here is the same form that we've been looking at, to have affection for. So I told my dad that this sermon would not be complete without talking about what specific book. And he guessed Philippians, the love chapter, which is 1 Corinthians 13, which we already have briefly looked at, but we will get into more. And I went, no. Song of Solomon. If we're going to talk about love, we got to talk about Song of Solomon because it's literally a love song in the Bible. And there are 4 different types of love referenced in this book. The one that we've been looking at is used twice in its masculine form and 11 times in feminine form. And that is by far the feminine form of, ahava is by far the most frequently used word for love that's used in this book. But there's a couple other ones that we're going to look at. So in the first chapter, Song of Solomon, verse 2, and this is the part, for just brief background for everybody, Song of Solomon consists of basically 3 characters, and it's presented almost in the form of, not a play, because there's not like stage directions in there, but like a dramatic reading maybe. So there's the guy and the woman he's talking to, or the woman who's talking to him, and their friends, a collective group of people. In most cases, when the group of people talks about love, they're using the singular masculine form, but it gets translated as a group of people because that made sense to the translators, I guess. Conveys the story better that way, I guess. So verse 2, this is the lady's part, and she says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine." And here we see a new form of yet another Hebrew word for love, which is dod, spelled D-O-W-D, when you translate it into English, or just D-O-D. And the definition is a little foggy because it's from like an unused root word of it. It doesn't get used anymore. But in a literal sense, the proper usage for it, as near as they can tell, would mean to boil. I guess like to boil water. But figuratively, which is what we're concerned about, because that means to love. So a slang word for love, essentially. By implication, a love token, a lover, a friend, or specifically an uncle or a well-beloved, the father's brother, which was interesting. So it's the main part here is that it's implied to mean love when the word gets used, but it means, literally, it would have been meant to boil. And we see that again used in the friends, actually, down in verse 4, or the second half of verse 4, the friends say, "We will be glad and rejoice in thee. We will remember thy love more than wine." And they're kind of using that same word, whether that's in reference to her saying it that way earlier or not, I'm not sure. And then verse 4 ends with the woman again responding, "The upright love thee," whereas NIV says, "How right they are to adore you." And that's back to the ahab, the masculine form of love that we looked at before. And then in verse 9, he actually uses, this is the guy's speaking part, the first one he gets. And he says, "I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots." Such a romantic. And that is raya, which is a feminine form of ra'ah, and used to indicate an associate, more or less close, so just varying degrees, or a brother, a companion, a fellow, a friend, husband, a lover, or a neighbor, or with another. So this is what he uses when he refers to his love. He's referring to her as in the feminine form of a companion or a friend. So I guess we can take that as a like a girlfriend kind of. He's calling her, my girlfriend. I've compared you to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. And then in verse 15, there's in between these, she says some stuff, but verse 15, it's his part again, and he says, "Behold, thou art fair, my love," and it's the same usage here of kind of like a girlfriend kind of sense. Chapter 2, we see it again. He refers to her, "So is my love, as the lily among the thorns, so is my love among the daughters." Same kind of thing. Verse 10, now she's saying it. Is that or I missed a change? But now she's saying, "My beloved spake to me and said unto me," and that's it. She's quoting him saying it about her, which is why it's still feminine form. "Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. The fig tree putteth forth her green leaves, and the vines with tender grapes give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." That was verse 10 and 13. We jumped a little bit, but that whole part is she's telling, I guess, her friends, "Hey, this is what he said to me. Isn't he so sweet?" And then chapter 3 has a couple verses of reference love. Same thing we've looked at before. Feminine form of ahaba. Chapter 4, verse 1, we get to the he is speaking again, up through verse 15. And twice we see him use that girlfriend phrasing. "Behold, thou art fair, my love." And then again in verse 7, "Thou art all fair, my love." But in verse 10, he's still talking and he uses a different word. Here he uses dode, like we looked at before. So, "How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse, how much better is thy love than wine." And this is the same comparison that they used earlier at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, when the friends are, "Oh, we'll remember your love much better than wine." So really, we only see this used, at least in these cases, it's always used in comparison to a drink. So I don't know if that's part of why they chose that particular one. A lot of these, they end up with various, they have words, and we'll get to it in the Greek in a little bit, but they'll come up with a word for love of a very specific thing or a type of thing. In fact, we've pretty much covered the 4 different forms of love as they're expressed in Song of Solomon. So we'll jump to Ezekiel quick, because that introduces another new one. Ezekiel 33, verse 31. So this is a message that Ezekiel receives from God concerning the fall of Jerusalem. If your Bible has headers, that's what it's going to say. Ezekiel, a message about the fall of Jerusalem or something. The Lord, and in this message, the Lord is describing the behavior of the Israelites, and he speaks of love in a concrete sense, and I'll explain that here in a second. So the verse 33-31 says, "My people come to you as they usually do, and they sit before you to hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. Their mouths speak of love, but their hearts are greedy for unjust gain." So this one is interesting to me, at least, because the word that the Hebrew word is eged, E-G-E-B, and they pronounce them much different. And it's love, but in a concrete sense, as opposed to agaba, which is love in an abstract sense. So they have different words for each. So we know that they chose this one because they're not talking about abstract sense. Egab, the one that we're looking at here, is an amative word, much love or very lovely, versus its comparison word, love in the abstract sense, that gets used in a more amorousness or inordinate love sense. So they are, their mouths speak of love in a definite sense. So this isn't an abstract concept of love to them. This is the Israelites, instead of listening to God's word, are talking about love of other things, but not as a concept, or like, this is what I love sense. And that became the issue, one of the issues leading to the fall of Jerusalem. They'd lost their love of God and started pursuing other interests, and this word egeb, it kind of shows us that this is something that was like definitely happening. Not, man, wouldn't it be great if like we had a different God maybe or something, in this like abstract philosophical sense. They were actively talking about, they loved ice cream or they loved money. We'll get to that one in a second. More than God, or cheesecake, right? The cheesecake example. So Matthew 6, verse 5. Now we're getting away from the Hebrew words, and we're getting into all the Greek words for love. Stay on the thing. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. This word, love, is... There's a bunch of these. I gotta find the right one. And a lot of these are just derivatives of each other. Phileo, which I told you we'd talk about. Phileo, from philos, to be a friend to, fond of an individual or an object, i.e. to have affection for, denoting a personal attachment as a matter of sentiment or feeling. And they compare this to agapo, which we'll talk about the next one that we look at. In Luke, we'll get to that. Agapo is a wider sense of love, embracing especially the judgment and the deliberate assent of the will as a matter of principle, duty, and propriety. And then it gives us some examples of how these two words were similar in meaning but different in scope. Phileo, which is a Greek word that referred to an active choice of something, not love necessarily. And then another word, so philo was an active choice, and belomahi is a reflexive choice. There's still choice involved, but one is like premeditated, and the other one's like, hey, we're going out for pizza. Do you want to come with us? And you go, yeah, sure. That's below me. Versus the, I want pizza. I'm going to make pizza tonight. I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to buy flour. I made pizza twice this week. It's very delicious. And I'm hungry. So one is a premeditated choice and one is reflexive. And that's similar in nature. Phileo is, in its usage, similar to how phileo, the love that we're talking about, is used. It's a distinctive, like premeditated decision. And that's what we see in Matthew. When in reference to the hypocrites and their love of standing on street corners, this is a premeditated thing that they have affection for, which is interesting because it says fond of an individual or an object, but also it talks about, but in this sense, they have a love of doing a thing, which isn't part of their definition, but clearly was used in that way. And Matthew 23:6 is used in a similar context. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. And this is the only two times that this form of love is used in the book of Matthew. They're used in the context of the hypocrites and their desire to be, how much they want to be put in places where they receive adoration of just other people. They want to look good in public. And their desire to be in those situations is expressed in this premeditated, thoughtful, they say to have affection for, and they have affection for being in these things. They love the praise of people. Not that premeditated love, like phileo, is wrong, but it's wrong when you're putting all that thought into choosing the wrong thing. This is the same word that's used by Peter when Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him, which we see in John 21, 15, and 17. And, mirroring, of course, the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus. And so to make up for each of those, Jesus asks him, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yes, you know that I love you. It's the same premeditated, conscious choice. So it's not about the choice itself, choosing to love something. It's about choosing to love the praise of people versus the praise of God more. Luke 10:27, we see, in answering, he said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And this is going into the story for the Good Samaritan. And this is the love that's used here in Luke when he's quoting the law, because this is an expert in the law, is how King James describes him. He comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to be saved? He says, well, follow the laws. What are the laws? Have you kept them? And he goes, yes, I have. So he's saying, thou shalt love the Lord thy God. And he's quoting from Scripture, which would have been Greek. And this is that agapo love, which compares very similarly to some of the Hebrew words we looked at, to love in a social or a moral sense. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. Love him in a social way, much the same way that God so loved us. Return that love to him in an equal manner. And we'll get to this. I think it's in the definition. We'll get to this in a little bit, hopefully. And then in verse 37, at the end of the story, he replies, so Jesus tells the story, he gives 3 examples of people, and then the Good Samaritan, he says, now which one of these was a good neighbor? He says, the one who had mercy on him. So mercy being part of that love. If we have love for others, we're willing to show mercy to them. 1 Timothy 6:10, which is the one that people love to quote, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And the word that we see here is a unique one in that it's derived from a word that means fond of silver. So we're talking about being a love of money, which is itself just kind of like saying, more, better, or like good, better, best. This is just the next step up from that. So there's fond of money, and then there's love of money. So this is just the extension of being fond of money, which leads to that. Which is itself just a compound word, basically. They took philos, meaning friendly love, and argyros, meaning silver, and they combined them together to make a word specifically for love of money. Which is interesting because it's still that brotherly love at the root of it. But again, when it's focused in the wrong place, it becomes an unhealthy. That's when you start to see issues. Ephesians 5:23 and verse 33, King James Version. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ has also loved the church and gave himself for it. Both instances here we see is that agape love that we've talked about. God to love the world, that same one. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, same usage, agapo. So really quick, just want to end with 1 Corinthians 1:13 because that is what my verse is from. The NIV version says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. That's from the NIV version. King James, I preface with the first three verses. So that was verses 4 through 8, and then we jumped down to 13 that Nancy read for us. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3 in King James says, though I speak with tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could move mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all to feed the poor, and though I give to my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Now abideth faith, hope, charity, but the greatest of these is charity. So King James, and I didn't realize that because I've always heard it as faith, hope, love, and the greatest of these is love. And I thought that was interesting because then I'm looking at I read it in NIV and it matched what I understood it to, what I thought it was going to be. So I'm looking down the list and I'm getting like 1 Corinthians is just not in here at all. And so then I was like, all right, well, I know where the verse is, so I'm just going to go to the King James. I'm just going to look up that verse in King James and see what word they used instead. And that's when I realized that they're translating this as charity. And every instance in the Bible, for those of you that like to read out of King James or you're following the one out of the back of the pew, every instance of charity in the Bible is coming from a Greek word, agape, which is usually what we hear, the Greek word, whatever, which is itself derived from the agapo that we've been talking about. For God so loved the world, the agapo loved the world. But when they translate it as charity, in the King James, it's always the same Greek word, agape, love or affection or benevolence, especially a plural, a love feast or a feast of charity, dear, love, those types of words. So every instance that you see, if you're reading King James, charity, it's still talking about love. So being charitable, being merciful, plus everything that Paul talks about here. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself. It is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But wherever there be prophecies, they shall fail. Wherever there be tongues, they shall cease. Wherever there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. So yeah, I didn't realize that that was a thing. I never made that connection between charity and love until um, looking up the wrong, looking up the verse that I wanted in the wrong translation. And again, we see love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, pray for those if you love those. These are all that agape love. So charity, love, in King James at least, all being translated roughly as the same thing. That concludes that. I had so many more. We got through like the first 2 pages of Greek words, and there's a lot more, but that's all we have time for. I hope that if nothing else, I could have done this entire sermon in about 3 minutes or less, giving you an introduction, read 1 Corinthians 13 in its entirety, why not, and called it good. But I felt that the dive into some of the original Greek and Hebrew would hopefully enlighten everybody, kind of give you a better idea of what we are talking about in some of these instances. So now I'm never going to read King James the same way. Every time I see charity, I'll know that they're talking about just a various of the same kind of love that God had for us. And something else that occurred to me as we were doing this, God is love. And I didn't take the time to go dig up these verses for it. But we were told that God is love and that we were created in his image. So our expression of love to others is part of living in that image. So if for no other reason, we're supposed to have, I didn't get to it, I thought I had it in here, but no greater love is there than he laid down his life for someone else. And I forget where I had that, but it's on a page somewhere, and notes are all out of order now. But the love that we're called to have, at the very least, is a charitable and a merciful love, just in a social and a moral sense. You don't have to care about people personally. It does make a better connection with people if you do. But at least just caring about the well-being of others and just being nice to people is ultimately what we're called to do. Now we're going to have our closing song.